Are you going to punish me, your majesty, or are you just going to stare? His massive hands slammed against the cold stone on either side of my head, trapping me instantly. The jagged, vicious scar tearing across his jawline was inches from my face, his chest heaving with a terrifying silent intensity. I knew I should have lowered my eyes. I knew an unbonded Omega was supposed to submit, but the golden fire burning in his gaze, it didn't look like anger at all. It looked exactly like. If you are searching for werewolf romance audiobooks spicy enough to make your pulse hammer, you've found your next obsession. This is the story of what happens when a fiercely guarded Omega accidentally insults the most dangerous, devastatingly silent alpha king in the realm, only to realize his brutal, unspoken focus is actually the fated mate bond violently snapping into place. It's an agonizing, slow-burn battle of wills, and only one of us is going to surrender. Welcome back to Storm's Werewolf Romance Library. I'm so glad you're here. Comment claimed. If you would want a terrifyingly protective alpha to fight for you, please take a quick second to like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can keep growing together. The heavy velvet curtains of the Great Hall were drawn tight against the biting mountain wind. A stark, freezing contrast to the warm, sun-drenched streets of Canada I still saw in my dreams. I stood with my back pressed firmly against the frost-covered stone, praying the deep shadows of the Silver Fang Ballroom would simply swallow me whole. The Mating Gala had just begun. The sprawling room suffocating beneath the heavy scent of burning cedar and terrified Omegas, and for a female who refused to be silenced, it felt entirely like an execution. Chapter 1. The Sound of Tearing Silk. The Mating Gala of the Silver Fang territory was a suffocating display of archaic tradition I desperately wanted no part of. I pressed my spine against the freezing stone of the grand ballroom, willing myself to blend into the shadows. Heavy velvet curtains shut out the biting mountain wind. The space smelled overwhelmingly of roasted meats, burning cedar, and the sharp sweat of unbonded females pacing the floor. I tugged my shawl tighter, shivering from the predatory energy buzzing through the room. My mother had warned me about nights like this long before I fled to seek refuge in these mountains. I could still see the phantom image of her vibrant spirit draining away, crushed beneath the heavy hand of my dominating alpha father. I swore a blood oath to myself that I would never allow a male to silence my thoughts. Yet here I was, an unbonded Omega trapped in the center of the most aggressive mating ritual known to our kind. I kept my gaze fixed on my boots, dodging the wandering eyes of towering warriors. A sudden gust of freezing wind swept through the ballroom as the iron-bound doors were thrust open, silencing the low hum of conversation. The temperature plummeted sharply, sending a violent shiver down my spine. King Maddox stepped over the threshold, his massive frame casting a long, dark shadow that swallowed the light. He was a mountain of scarred muscle wrapped in dark leather, radiating a lethal violence that demanded absolute submission without uttering a single syllable. The vicious scar tearing across his jawline caught the firelight, a stark reminder of the feral beast he became to seize this throne. Nervous whispers rippled through the gathered crowds, tearing through the heavy silence before dying out as he stepped further into the light. He never attended these gatherings, choosing instead to rule his frozen territory with an iron grip and brooding silence. His reputation was painted in blood, a leader who let his massive claws speak for him. I pressed myself harder against the stone, my fingernails digging painfully into my palms as I tried to shrink away. The primal part of my brain screamed at me to expose my throat. A biological betrayal I fought with every ounce of willpower. Maddox moved through the parting sea of bowing bodies with a lethal grace that seemed unnatural for a male of his staggering size. He didn't look left or right, his terrifyingly bright eyes fixed dead ahead. I watched the steady flex of his broad shoulders under his dark tunic, unable to look away from the sheer power rolling off him. he stopped near the center of the room, standing unnervingly still, like a predator waiting to strike. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, convinced that if I breathed loudly, those burning eyes would snap in my direction. The fragile silence holding the room hostage shattered abruptly when a clumsy, overly eager alpha tried to push his way forward. He shoved past a group of trembling females, his heavy boots slipping on a patch of melted snow. Before I could register the movement, his massive shoulders slammed violently into my side, knocking the breath from my lungs. I flailed my arms desperately, my boots scrambling for traction as I was thrown backward toward the raised dais, holding the sacred banners of the royal bloodline. Time slowed to an agonizing crawl as I fell, my hands grabbing blindly. My fingers closed around heavy embroidered silk, and for a fraction of a second, I thought I had miraculously saved myself. Then came the sound, a sickening ripping noise that echoed like a gunshot through the absolute dead silence of the terrified ballroom. I crashed hard onto the floor, the torn half of the sacred royal crest pooling around my trembling legs like a damning shroud. The visiting alpha who knocked me over took one look at the destroyed artifact and scrambled backward, leaving me completely isolated. The ringing in my ears was deafening, drowning out the sharp gasps of shock. I scrambled to my knees, my breath coming in short pants, as my hands hovered uselessly over the ruined edges of the priceless banner. My skin burned hot with paralyzing humiliation, every instinct screaming that I had committed an unforgivable crime. Slowly, the dense circle of bodies around me began to part, backing away as if my misfortune were a contagious disease. I didn't need to look up to know what was happening. The heavy scent of burning cedar closing in told me everything. The king turned his attention away from the empty throne and was intensely focused on me. I forced my chin up, refusing to cower like a beaten dog, and found myself staring directly into the blazing, molten gold of King Maddox's eyes. The impact of his stare was physical, hitting me squarely in the chest, like a brutal blow that forcibly expelled the oxygen from my lungs. The entire world outside of his looming frame faded into a dull blur, locking us in a tunnel of intense, completely unbroken eye contact. I saw the muscles in his scarred jaw flex tightly, his expression totally unreadable, yet boiling with an undercurrent of raw emotion. I was trapped in the terrifying gravity of his stare, my independent spirit clashing violently against the overwhelming instinct to surrender entirely. No one dared to move, the entire fortress held in a state of suspended animation as the king assessed the tiny defiant female who destroyed his sacred crest. I braced my trembling shoulders, lifting my chin a fraction of an inch higher, desperately trying to mask the absolute terror threatening to crack my ribs. I fully expected him to summon his guards, to wave his massive hand and have me dragged down into the freezing darkness of the mountain's dungeons. Instead, Maddox slowly shifted his immense weight, planting one heavy boot in front of the other, beginning a slow, deliberate walk directly toward me. I locked my knees and held my breath, entirely helpless to run away as the most lethal monster in the realm closed the distance, leaving me bracing for a brutal punishment. Would the scarred king tear me apart for ruining his sacred crest? Or was the consuming heat in his golden eyes a far more dangerous kind of punishment? Chapter 2. The Breathless Laugh. The rhythmic, heavy thud of King Maddox's boots echoed like a death knell against the frozen stone floor. Every step he took dissolved the periphery of the grand ballroom into a useless blur, narrowing my entire universe down to the devastatingly massive alpha stalking toward me. The ambient light of the roaring hearths seemed to catch only on him, highlighting the ultra-realistic texture of his battle-worn leather armor and the lethal grace of his predatory stride. The intricate weaving of his dark tunic, the faint metallic glint of his armguards, and the rough, weathered grain of his leather gauntlets stood out with startling cinematic clarity. I scrambled frantically to my feet, my torn silk dress tangling around my ankles as I desperately backed away until my shoulder blades hit the unyielding chill of the fortress wall. The silence in the hall was absolute, a heavy, a crushing pressure pressing down on my eardrums as the king finally stopped mere inches from my trembling form. Up close, the sheer scale of him was terrifying, a towering, insurmountable wall of muscle and heat that completely blocked out the rest of the frightened onlookers. I tilted my head all the way back just to meet his intense gaze, my heart hammering violently against my ribs as I waited for the brutal punishment my mother always swore would come to a disobedient Omega. His golden eyes swept over my face, scanning my terrified frozen features with a burning razor-sharp focus that felt entirely too intimate for a ruthless executioner. My panicked gaze darted frantically over his harsh features, searching desperately for any sign of mercy, but my focus snagged entirely on the violent, jagged scar carving across his jawline. Yes, it was a vicious, angry mark, pulling the skin tight and giving his devastatingly handsome face an aura of pure, untamed savagery that made my pulse race. The sheer, overwhelming absurdity of my situation suddenly crashed over me, a refugee Omega from the warm, sun-drenched coastal streets of my childhood, about to meet her tragic end over a torn piece of embroidered fabric in a frozen mountain fortress. A sharp, breathless laugh burst from my lips before I could lock it behind my teeth, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock that completely shattered the agonizing quiet of the enormous room. I slapped a shaking hand over my mouth a second too late, my wide, terrified eyes watching the king's broad shoulders freeze entirely at the inappropriate sound. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered pack, the sound muffled and distant as my entire focus locked exclusively on the sudden violent darkening of Maddox's golden irises. He didn't strike me down, and he didn't summon his brutal guards to drag me away into the freezing shadows of the dungeons. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate half-step forward, seamlessly invading the last remaining inch of my personal space and crowding me flush against the unyielding icy stone. The sheer size of him blotted out the flickering torches, casting us in a deeply intimate shadow that felt completely detached from the hundreds of horrified witnesses watching us. He brought his massive, heavily calloused hands up, slamming his palms flat against the wall on either side of my head, with a booming thud that made my breath stutter painfully. I was completely caged, physically trapped between the unforgiving architecture of his ancient fortress and the overwhelming radiant heat pouring off his towering frame. He leaned down slowly, his scarred face hovering a mere breath away from my trembling lips, bringing the rich, intoxicating scent of burning cedar and crushed winter mint directly into my lungs. The scent was a devastating physical blow, a sudden, blinding rush of sensory information that bypassed every logical defense I had spent my entire life carefully building. A violent, soul-deep shudder ripped through my core as the fated mate bond suddenly snapped into place with the terrifying, unstoppable force of a falling star. The connection was instantaneous and profound, permanently tying my frantic, racing pulse directly to the slow, heavy rhythm of the massive chest pressing so dangerously close to mine. I gasped out loud, my fingers instinctively curling into tight fists to stop myself from reaching out to desperately grip the front of his dark leather tunic. I could feel the intense, possessive, territorial claim radiating fiercely off him. A heavy, unseen weight that demanded my complete and utter surrender without him ever needing to open his mouth. My rational mind screamed in absolute rebellion, utterly terrified of the suffocating, inescapable cage this divine bond represented. But my treacherous body was already melting into his commanding warmth. He lowered his face intimately into the sensitive curve of my neck, his impossibly hot breath ghosting over my rapidly beating pulse point, causing my knees to tremble violently. And every fiber of my being waited in agonizing suspense for him to speak the sacred words of claiming, to verbally acknowledge the monumental, world-altering shift that had just permanently bound our lives together. I desperately needed him to break the deafening quiet, to offer a single thread of verbal reassurance that I hadn't just lost my hard-won autonomy to a silent, unyielding dictator. I waited in breathless, excruciating agony, the seconds stretching into an unending eternity as the scorching heat of his skin branded me completely through the thin fabric of my ruined dress. He dragged his nose slowly, deliberately along my jawline. A deeply intimate, fiercely claiming gesture that sent a chaotic, dizzying mix of pure terror and profound desire swirling fiercely through my veins. The golden fire in his eyes burned infinitely brighter than the roaring hearths when he finally pulled back to hold my frantic gaze, his expression etched with a raw, terrifyingly fierce possessiveness. Yet he kept his jaw firmly clamped shut, stubbornly refusing to utter a single syllable to explain the devastating, life-changing intensity of his actions. The sheer, crushing force of his continued silence felt like a brutal physical punishment, leaving me entirely unmoored and drowning in a sea of overwhelming sensory overload. He was undeniably claiming me in front of his entire pack, aggressively marking me with his overwhelming proximity and his potent scent, but simultaneously trapping me in an agonizing void of emotional uncertainty. By steadfastly refusing to speak, he held all the power in the dynamic, offering me no comforting reassurances, no future promises, and absolutely no way to understand the terrifyingly dominant male I was now permanently tied to. He stared down at me with those burning, possessively golden eyes, communicating absolute ownership solely through his terrifying physical presence. How could I possibly survive a lifetime bound to a mate who claimed me in shadows and intimidation, leaving me completely alone in the dark, trapped by the overwhelming heat of his silent claim? I realized the terrifying Alpha King had just locked our fates together without giving me a single word to hold on to. Chapter 3: The Gilded Cage. The heavy oak doors closed behind my guards with a final thud. I was isolated in a sprawling, meticulously appointed chamber that felt beautifully suffocating. My frantic pacing carried me across plush rugs, my eyes darting over the towering arched windows that framed the brutal mountain peaks. The moonlight bled through the frost-covered glass with a striking cinematic realism, casting dramatic shadows across the carved mahogany furniture. Every luxurious detail was rendered with an ultra-realistic clarity in my hyper-aware state, yet it couldn't mask the terrifying reality of my captivity. I gripped my arms tightly, shivering violently despite the roaring fire in the massive stone hearth. The agonizing anticipation clawed at my throat as I replayed the horrifying moments in the grand ballroom, the phantom weight of his burning stare still pressing heavily against my skin. I had fled the warm, bustling, sun-drenched streets of Lagos to escape the exact kind of suffocating male dominance that had slowly drained the life from my mother's eyes. My entire existence was a fierce rebellion against the concept of a fated bond, an absolute refusal to be stripped of my autonomy. Yet, the universe had cruelly tethered my soul to a male whose terrifying reputation was built entirely on violence. I paced another tight circle, rapidly building an impenetrable fortress of sharp, defensive sarcasm to shield my absolute terror. The heavy iron latch on the chamber door clicked with a sharp ring, immediately freezing the frantic pacing of my boots. My breath caught sharply as the heavy wood swung open and King Maddox filled the doorway, his massive frame eclipsing the dim corridor light. My vision tunneled, in the background blurring out in a shallow depth of field that left my focus agonizingly trapped on the terrifying Alpha. He still wore the dark battle-worn leather from the gala, but his dangerous predatory energy had shifted into something entirely unreadable. Instead of the heavy chains I had morbidly anticipated, his scarred hands carefully balanced an ornate silver tray laden with steaming food. The rich aroma of roasted meats hit my starving senses, mingling intensely with his potent natural scent of burning cedar and crushed winter mint. I backed away slowly as he stepped fully into the room, my defensive instincts warring violently against this confusing display of domestic service. The silence stretching between us was absolute and deafening. A heavy pressure that made the frantic hammering of my pulse echo loudly in my own ears. King Maddox moved with an eerie, lethal grace, crossing the vast space without making a single sound, his burning golden eyes never leaving my face. He approached the intricately carved table near the roaring hearth and gently set the heavy tray down with jarringly delicate precision. The sheer contrast of his brutal, muscle-bound arms against the tender, providing action, sent a dizzying wave of cognitive dissonance crashing through my brain. He stood up to his towering height, waiting patiently for me to approach. My mind scrambled desperately to process the intensely intimate tableau, my defensive walls snapping into place as I crossed my arms tightly over my chest. Is this supposed to be my final meal before you lock me in the dungeons? Or are you just trying to fatten up your new captive? I snapped, as the sharp sarcasm masking the violent trembling in my hands. I desperately wanted him to roar back, to give me the tyrannical monster I had meticulously prepared myself to fight against. The silence only stretched further, a heavy tension that pulled agonizingly at the newly forged unseen bond tying our pulses together. He didn't flinch at my barbed words. Instead, a fleeting softening flickered through his molten golden eyes. He turned his body slightly, gesturing toward the steaming food in a silent, unwavering invitation. The unyielding quiet felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest, slowly cracking the foundation of the righteous anger I was clinging to. I stubbornly dug the heels of my boots into the rug as I glared up at the towering, immovable king. I'm not a pet for you to quietly feed and keep locked away in a high tower, Your Majesty. I bit out, my voice trembling as the terrifying intimacy of the room closed in. Maddox finally eliminated the distance between us, his overwhelming heat sinking directly into my freezing bones. The space crackled with a thick friction, a raw magnetic pull that forced my chin up to meet the intense focus of his unwavering stare. I held my breath, every muscle completely rigid, as I braced for a harsh, dominating correction. He slowly lifted one massive, heavily calloused hand toward my face, the movement so deliberate that my chaotic mind couldn't register it as a threat. I squeezed my eyes shut, a pathetic involuntary flinch betraying the deep-seated terror I had been trying so desperately to hide. The strike never came. Instead, the rough, some warm pads of his fingers brushed impossibly softly against my cheek, sending a bright spark of electricity shooting straight down my spine. He gently caught a stray, trembling curl that had escaped my braids, carefully tucking it behind my ear with a tender reverence that absolutely shattered my reality. The breathtakingly gentle touch lingered for a fraction of a second against my pulse point, just long enough for me to feel a slight tremor in his hand. He stepped backward, his golden eyes blazing with silent sorrow, and soundlessly exited the chamber. The heavy latch clicked shut once more, leaving me entirely alone with the roaring fire and the devastatingly undeniable proof of his silent, protective nature. My knees buckled beneath me, sending me sinking heavily onto the edge of the plush bed as my entire worldview violently realigned itself. The ghost of his impossibly soft touch still burned fiercely against my skin, a branding mark of tenderness that terrified me infinitely more than his brutal reputation ever could. I stared blindly at the steaming food he had brought, the sharp anger that had kept me safe for years, melting away into a profoundly vulnerable puddle of confusion. The realization crashed over me with the devastating force of a tidal wave, entirely upending the battle lines I had drawn. I knew exactly how to harden my heart and fight back against a cruel, dominating monster, but fighting the devastatingly gentle devotion of a silent giant was going to completely ruin my defenses. I had meticulously prepared myself to face down a ruthless beast, only to realize his gentle silence was the one weapon capable of breaking my heart. Chapter 4. Shadows and Winter Mint. The sprawling stone corridors of the Silverfang Fortress were an intricate ancient labyrinth of shadows and freezing drafts. I wandered the cavernous halls freely, my soft footsteps swallowed by the heavy woven rugs that lined the floor. Every towering arched window framed a breathtaking, ultra-realistic landscape of brutal snow-capped peaks, starkly alien compared to the warm, sun-baked earth of my childhood in Lagos. Yet, despite my unrestricted movement, I was never truly alone. A massive silent shadow tracked my every move, always lingering just at the edge of my vision. King Maddox did not treat me like a prisoner, nor did he issue a single command regarding my daily routines. Instead, he assumed the role of a looming unspoken protector, his formidable presence acting as a constant heavy pressure against my awareness. If I paused to study a tapestry, he stopped 10 paces behind me, a brooding sentinel carved from muscle and restraint. His relentless vigilance was a suffocating blanket that I constantly fought against, determined to prove my independence. I kept my chin held high, refusing to acknowledge the strange fluttering rhythm my pulse adopted whenever his golden eyes tracked my movements. The true test of my crumbling composure arrived during the mandatory evening gathering in the grand communal hall. Hundreds of massive shifters crowded into the space, their booming laughter and aggressive posturing echoing off the vaulted stone ceilings. The overwhelming volume of the pack was a stark contrast to the quiet, more disciplined courtyards of my past, creating a dizzying sensory overload that immediately spiked my anxiety. I stood near the periphery, my fingers twisting tightly into the fabric of my dress as giant warriors brushed past me. The sheer, terrifying scale of these mountain wolves made me feel incredibly small and entirely vulnerable. Unable to endure the crushing claustrophobia of the crowd for another second, I slipped away from the main floor and retreated into a narrow, unlit alcove tucked behind a massive stone pillar. The shadows here were absolute, offering a desperately needed reprieve from the intense prying eyes of the Silverfang wolves. I leaned my trembling back against the freezing masonry, closing my eyes and forcing my breathing to steady into a manageable rhythm. It was supposed to be a safe haven, a quiet pocket of isolation where I could rebuild my shattered emotional armor. However, my sanctuary lasted only a fraction of a heartbeat before the temperature in the small space drastically shifted. The heavy, intoxicating scent of burning cedar and crushed winter mint washed over me an instant before King Maddox stepped into the alcove, completely blocking the exit. The ambient light from the hall completely fell away, leaving us in a dimly lit cinematic pocket of isolation where my focus narrowed into a sharp, shallow depth of field. He stood impossibly close, his towering frame caging me against the wall without actually making physical contact. His broad shoulders brushed the stone on either side of the narrow entryway, an absolute physical barrier standing between me and the chaotic noise of the pack. I snapped my eyes open, my breath catching painfully in my throat as his golden gaze locked onto mine with a burning laser-like intensity. The proximity was utterly devastating, stripping away every logical argument I had meticulously crafted against the fated bond. The freezing chill of the stone seeped through the back of my dress, causing a violent shiver to rip through my shoulders. Maddox tracked the involuntary movement instantly, his jaw clenching as his eyes darkened with a sudden, fierce protectiveness. He didn't ask for permission, and he didn't offer a single word of comfort to ease the raw tension crackling between us. He simply reached up with slow, deliberate grace and unfastened the heavy clasp of his massive fur-lined cloak. With a smooth, fluid motion, he swept the heavy garment from his own shoulders and settled it securely around mine. On the warm weight of the fur pressing down like a physical embrace, the immediate transfer of his body heat was a shocking contrast to the bitter cold. But it was the overwhelming explosion of his scent that truly dismantled my defenses. The cloak was entirely saturated with him, the primal masculine essence of the Alpha King, wrapping securely around my throat and lungs. He was deliberately marking me, bathing me in his absolute protection so that every wolf in the hall would smell exactly who I belonged to. The gesture was an incredibly dominant, territorial claim. Yet the agonizing gentleness of his hands, as he adjusted the heavy collar, completely contradicted the violence of the act. I stood entirely frozen, my face tipped up toward his scarred jaw as the intoxicating aroma of winter mint hijacked my nervous system. My mind screamed at me to throw the cloak off, to violently reject this primal display of ownership and demand my personal space. Instead, my traitorous hands rose on their own accord, my fingers burying deeply into the plush fur to pull the rich, comforting heat even closer to my trembling body. His golden eyes flared wildly at my subtle surrender, his chest heaving with a sudden jagged breath that mirrored the frantic hammering of my own heart. I was trapped in a terrifying, beautiful contradiction, my fierce, independent spirit waging a losing war against a soul-deep biological craving. Maddox leaned down, his face hovering mere inches from mine as he inhaled deeply, savoring the scent of our mingled auras, intertwining in the dark alcove. The sheer, overwhelming power radiating from his silent form made my knees weak. I'm melting the last stubborn remnants of my logical resistance. I hated him for stripping away my control without ever uttering a single sound, yet as the heavy silence stretched between us, my body betrayed me completely. I found myself leaning unconsciously into his overwhelming heat, utterly terrified by the realization that my heart was already violently craving his closeness, despite my mind's desperate screams to run. Wrapped tightly in the overwhelming scent of the king, I realized with absolute terror that my fierce independence was no match for the deep biological craving dragging me toward him. Chapter 5. The Silent Threat. The grand dining hall was a masterpiece of cinematic realism, the roaring central hearth casting deep shadows across the stone walls. I sat near the head of the mahogany table, the fur cloak King Maddox had draped over my shoulders, acting as a shield against the mountain chill. An arrogant, highly vocal alpha named Gideon had arrived before nightfall, bringing boisterous warriors that disrupted the pack's quiet rhythm. Gideon possessed a brash energy that set my nerves on edge, his booming voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings as he held court. I picked nervously at my plate, desperately trying to shrink into the luxurious fur and avoid the loud newcomer. Unfortunately, my attempt to remain inconspicuous failed entirely the moment Gideon's calculating gaze landed firmly on my tense form. He dismissed the pack elders mid-sentence, striding down the length of the table with the unchecked confidence of a male who was used to getting exactly what he wanted. The ambient noise of the dining hall seemed to blur into a shallow depth of field, my focus narrowing sharply as Gideon pulled out the heavy wooden chair directly beside mine and dropped into it. He smelled aggressively of sharp citrus and burnt copper, a clashing, abrasive scent that instantly made my stomach churn and my muscles lock into rigid defensive lines. He leaned in far too close, his bright, mocking eyes scanning my face as he openly assessed me like a prize placed on an auction block. It is a tragedy to see such a vibrant, beautiful Omega tucked away in this frozen wasteland, Gideon murmured loudly, his voice practically dripping with a patronizing sympathy that made my blood boil. He reached out, his fingers hovering entirely too close to my wrist, completely ignoring the potent, lingering aroma of winter mint and burning cedar that clung to my skin. A female with your striking features belongs in a court that appreciates her, showered in jewels and proper adoration, rather than left to freeze in the shadow of a mute brute. If you were mine, I would sing your praises, ensuring the world knew exactly how fiercely you were treasured. The empty, hollow promises grated against my ears, sounding exactly like the honey-coated traps my father used to weave before demanding absolute submission. I stiffened, a sharp retort instantly forming on the tip of my tongue, fully prepared to tear down his assumptions and defend my autonomy. But before I could draw the breath to speak, the temperature in the massive hall dropped with the violent force of an avalanche. The boisterous laughter and clinking of silver goblets died in an instant, replaced by a suffocating tension that practically sucked the oxygen from the room. I didn't need to turn my head to know that King Maddox had risen from his massive throne. The sheer pressure of his predatory focus crashed into my side, a physical weight that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand at absolute attention. Maddox moved with an ultra-realistic, terrifying grace, stepping out from the head of the table without making a single sound. He bypassed the terrified servers and rigid guards, his towering frame cutting through the room like a dark, lethal storm cloud gathering momentum. Every line of his body radiated pure, unadulterated violence. His jaw clamped so tightly, the vicious scar carving across his cheek stretched starkly white under the firelight. He didn't roar a challenge, and he didn't draw a weapon, but the absolute lethality of his approach froze the blood in my veins and forced Gideon to swallow audibly. The space between us crackled with dangerous static as the king stopped directly behind my chair, his immense heat washing over my trembling shoulders. Without breaking his blazing molten gold stare from the visiting alpha, Maddox reached past me, his heavily scarred hand coming down flat against the dark wood of the table. He placed it precisely in the center of the small gap separating Gideon and me, an insurmountable physical barrier crafted from raw muscle and restrained savagery. His knuckles were white with tension, the thick veins in his forearm bulging as he leaned his staggering weight over my shoulder, completely boxing me into the protective cage of his body. The message was devastatingly clear, a pure, wordless threat promising utter annihilation to anyone who dared to close that final distance. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, wildly intoxicated by the sheer scale of his silent possessiveness. He remained perfectly still, a magnificent beast holding a hair-trigger line of control, completely dominating the space and forcing Gideon to physically lean away from the heat of his anger. I sat completely paralyzed beneath the protective arch of his body, the rich scent of his winter mint obliterating the abrasive citrus of the visiting alpha. This was not the oppressive control I had spent my entire life running from. This was a fierce shield forged entirely to keep me safe. I looked up at the sharp, furious angle of his scarred jaw, a profound ache blooming deep in my chest as I realized exactly how far this silent king would go to defend me. He was willing to tear the world apart to keep me untouched, communicating a depth of devotion that no string of flowery words could ever hope to match. Gideon's arrogant smirk had vanished, replaced by a tense stare as he slowly raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender, carefully sliding his chair back from the table. The immediate physical threat was diffused, but the visiting alpha's eyes darted rapidly between Maddox's white-knuckled grip and my trembling, completely unprotected throat. A chilling, slow smile eventually crept back across Gideon's face as the tense silence stretched out, an expression completely devoid of genuine amusement. He slowly lowered his hands, leaning back in his chair with a triumphant gleam shining in his eyes. He hadn't won the physical confrontation, but as he stared at the terrifying mute beast violently guarding his unsealed mate, Gideon realized the silent king had a glaring, fatal weakness he could easily exploit. As the visiting alpha's slow, chilling smile spread across his face, I realized with a sick twist in my stomach that Maddox's fierce, silent protection had just handed our enemy the perfect weapon. Chapter 6. The Beta's Translation. The humiliating public display of possessiveness in the dining hall left me reeling, entirely consumed by a chaotic mixture of fierce adrenaline and profound anger. I stalked through the sprawling stone corridors of the fortress, my boots striking the floor with harsh, deliberate force. The sheer audacity of King Maddox, completely isolating me with his massive frame while simultaneously refusing to give me a single word of explanation, felt like a devastating betrayal. My mother's hollow eyes flashed in my memory, a sharp reminder of what happened to females who traded their voices for the protection of a dominant alpha. I pushed open the heavy oak doors to his private library, fully prepared to tear down the terrifying king and demand the autonomy he was silently stripping away. Maddox was standing by the massive arched window, the moonlight casting stark, ultra-realistic shadows across the vicious scar tearing through his jawline. He turned as I entered, his golden eyes instantly locking onto my furious form. In the deep scent of burning cedar and winter mint washing over me in an intoxicating wave. The sheer scale of his towering frame usually demanded absolute submission, but tonight my righteous anger completely overrode my survival instincts. I crossed the plush rugs, stopping only a few feet away, my hands clenched tightly into fists at my sides. The library was utterly silent, the crackle of the hearth fire entirely deafening as the heavy tension snapped between us like a physical tether. "Is that your grand strategy, Your Majesty?" I bit out, my voice trembling violently as the sharp words finally breached the agonizing quiet. "To simply claim my space, to trap me behind your massive shoulders, and expect me to bow my head and gratefully accept my gilded cage." I practically spat the words, as my defensive armor fully locked into place, as I stared up into his deeply shadowed face. I am not a pet to be silently protected and completely ignored. Your refusal to speak to me isn't some noble, mysterious trait. It is exactly the kind of suffocating control I spent my entire life trying to escape. My chest heaved with the force of the accusation, utterly terrified that my outburst would finally unleash the feral beast I had been warned about. Instead of roaring, Maddox's entire immense body went completely rigid. The blazing, possessive fire in his golden eyes extinguished in a fraction of a second, completely replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated devastation. He didn't step toward me. He actually took a slow, agonizing half-step backward, retreating into the deep shadows near the window. He slowly raised his heavily scarred hand, his thick fingers trembling slightly as he reached out toward me in a desperate, deeply vulnerable gesture. I squeezed my eyes shut and involuntarily flinched away, my muscles locking defensively as I anticipated the harsh grip of his retaliation. When I opened my eyes, Maddox was staring down at his empty hand with a look of absolute, soul-crushing defeat. The terrifying Alpha King, a male who commanded an army of brutal warriors, looked entirely broken by my tiny, involuntary movement. He let his arm drop heavily to his side, his broad chest rising and falling, with a silent, ragged breath that tore right through the anger shielding my heart. He didn't try to close the distance, and he didn't offer a single word to defend himself against my harsh accusations. He simply turned away, his massive shoulders completely slumped, and walked silently out of the library, leaving me entirely alone with the devastating weight of the shattered silence. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, plunging the vast room into a deeply oppressive stillness. My knees buckled slightly, my angry facade entirely melting away as the realization of his broken expression sank into my bones. Before I could process the sudden shift, a deep sigh broke the quiet from the far corner of the library. Finn, Maddox's beta and closest confidant, stepped out from the shadows of the towering bookshelves, his expression completely unreadable. He crossed the room slowly, stopping exactly where his king had been standing, bringing the sharp scent of old parchment and pine needles into my personal space. "You possess a remarkably sharp tongue for a female who completely misunderstands the battlefield she is standing on," Finn said softly, his voice devoid of the usual teasing warmth. I stiffened, fully expecting the beta to fiercely defend his king and demand my immediate submission to the unsealed mate bond. Instead, Finn crossed his arms over his chest, his gaze completely somber. "He doesn't stay silent to control you, little Omega. He stays silent because he is entirely convinced that he is a monster, completely unworthy of the light you carry. He is absolutely terrified that if he speaks, if he lets the feral beast he had to become to take this throne slip out, you will run away. The words hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow, entirely dismantling the rigid narrative I had built around the king's brooding nature. But my mind raced frantically, replaying every agonizingly tense moment since I tore the sacred banner. The gentle way he tucked the curl behind my ear, the desperate way he pressed his face into my hair, the total restraint he showed when Gideon threatened us. I had completely mistaken his overwhelming, paralyzing vulnerability for a cruel, dominating tactic. He wasn't trying to silence my voice. He was desperately trying to protect me from his own darkness, using his silence as a heavy, suffocating shield to keep the beast locked away. Finn turned toward the door, pausing with his hand resting heavily on the iron latch. You demanded words, but you are completely blind to the agonizingly loud devotion of a male who is quietly breaking his own heart just to make you feel safe. He didn't walk out because you angered him. He walked out because your fear of him completely destroyed the last shred of hope he had left. The heavy oak door shut softly behind the beta, leaving me entirely unmoored in the center of the massive library. The sharp, defensive anger that had kept me safe for years violently evaporated, completely replaced by a sickening, profound wave of understanding. I slowly dropped my face into my trembling hands, a ragged sob tearing from my throat as the devastating reality fully crashed over me. I hadn't bravely stood up to a terrifying tyrant. I had just brutally rejected the deeply wounded male who was desperately trying not to hurt me. The devastating realization crushed the last breath from my lungs. I hadn't fought off a monster. I had just broken the heart of a desperately devoted king. Chapter 7. The Cold Front. The brutal mountain blizzard struck the Silverfang fortress with a sudden deafening ferocity, rattling the heavy glass of my chamber windows. A vicious, howling gale swept down from the jagged peaks, carrying a bitter cold that rapidly seeped through the ancient stone walls and completely overwhelmed the glowing embers in my hearth. Within hours, the internal heating flues in my isolated wing completely failed, plunging my lavish room into a deep, freezing darkness. I huddled beneath every plush blanket I could find, my teeth chattering violently as the invasive frost crept steadily across the floorboards. The warm, vibrant memories of Lagos felt painfully distant as the agonizing chill sank deep into my marrow, leaving me completely vulnerable to the merciless winter storm. The heavy iron latch of my door clicked open just as my trembling reached an uncontrollable fever pitch. King Maddox stepped into the freezing room, his massive form barely illuminated by the dying silvery moonlight bleeding through the frosted panes. He didn't waste time looking around. His golden eyes immediately locked onto my shivering silhouette buried beneath the mound of furs. Moving with that characteristic silent urgency, he crossed the room in 3 long strides and scooped me up, blankets and all, directly into his overwhelming embrace. The sudden, radiant burst of his body heat was a staggering relief, surrounded instantly by the deeply intoxicating aroma of burning cedar and crushed winter mint. He carried me effortlessly through the dark, winding corridors of the fortress, unshielding my face against his broad chest until we reached the heavily guarded doors of his private chambers. His sanctuary was profoundly different from the rest of the cold, unyielding castle, radiating a deeply saturated, comforting warmth from a massive, roaring fireplace taking up an entire wall. He gently deposited me into the center of his enormous, incredibly soft bed, carefully tucking the heavy quilts around my trembling shoulders. Instead of joining me, Maddox gathered a sparse, rough woolen blanket from a chest and moved toward the hard stone floor near the hearth. The crushing weight of Finn's earlier revelation slammed into me all over again as I watched the terrifying Alpha King deliberately choose discomfort just to ensure I had the softest, warmest place to rest. I tried to protest, to demand that he take his rightful place, but my jaw was shaking too violently to form the words. As the night deepened, the blizzard outside intensified into a shrieking frenzy, dragging the internal temperature of the fortress down even further, despite the blazing fire. The heavy quilts were no match for the creeping, insidious frost that seemed to radiate from the very bones of the mountain, causing my entire body to rack with painful, violent shudders. From his place on the floor, Maddox's head snapped up, his golden eyes instantly tracking the desperate, involuntary tremors shaking my frame. He remained utterly still for a fraction of a second, his massive chest heaving as he visibly waged a brutal war against his own terrifying restraint. He could not stand to see me suffer. His fierce protective instincts violently overriding his deep-seated fear of his own monstrous reputation. Maddox discarded his thin blanket and rose to his full, staggering height, crossing the distance to the bed with a dark, determined grace. He pulled back the heavy quilts and slid his massive, heavily muscled frame into the space beside me, immediately dragging my freezing body flush against his burning chest. I gasped as my icy skin met the blazing furnace of his torso, entirely enveloped by his colossal size and the intoxicating scent of winter mint. He didn't utter a single syllable, but his heavy arms wrapped around me with an agonizingly gentle reverence, burying his scarred face into the crown of my hair to shield me from the biting cold. My rational mind, the part of me that had spent years building impenetrable defensive walls, completely melted away against his scorching heat. I fully expected him to take advantage of the intimate proximity, to leverage my vulnerability into a dominating physical claim. Instead, he functioned purely as a devoted human shield, his ragged breathing acting as a steady, soothing lullaby that carefully stitched my frayed nerves back together. I slowly uncurled my tightly clenched fists, tentatively resting my palms flat against his muscular chest, feeling the frantic, galloping rhythm of his heart beneath my fingertips. Safe within the unyielding cage of his arms, the last remnants of my fear violently evaporated, entirely replaced by a profound, unconditional trust that finally allowed me to drift into a deep, dreamless sleep. When my eyes fluttered open hours later, the howling wind outside had faded into a soft, steady hum, but the atmosphere inside the bed had drastically transformed. I was completely tangled with the towering king, my leg draped intimately over his thick thigh, my face pressed tightly against the rapid pulse hammering in his strong throat. Maddox was already awake, his body completely rigid beneath mine, his golden eyes blazing with a dark, consuming hunger that had absolutely nothing to do with the winter cold. The protective, innocent warmth of the night had violently shifted, completely replaced by a razor-sharp, heavy tension that made my breath hitch painfully in my lungs. He slowly dragged his heavily calloused hand up the curve of my spine, his touch igniting a blinding, undeniable desire that promised to entirely shatter the fragile peace between us. The safe, protective haven of the silent king's arms vanished in the morning light, instantly replaced by a razor-sharp, undeniable desire that promised to shatter all my remaining defenses. Chapter 8: Scars of the Past. The tension in the bed became too much to bear, forcing me to flee Maddox's chambers before my racing heart hammered completely through my ribs. I desperately needed to cool the frantic heat flushing my skin, leading my wandering steps down into the sprawling, glass-domed greenhouse tucked deep within the fortress walls. The space was a breathtaking sanctuary of lush, blooming flora, smelling vibrantly of crushed leaves, damp earth, and unblooming jasmine that offered a startling contrast to the frozen mountain peaks visible through the frost-streaked panes. I dragged my trembling fingers over the velvety petals of a strange dark blossom, trying to steady my chaotic breathing as the phantom weight of the Alpha King's massive body continued to press intensely against my memory. My desperate attempt at isolation was interrupted by the soft rustling of heavy skirts, announcing the arrival of Maeve, the revered pack healer I had briefly met upon my arrival. She possessed a deeply calming aura, her lined face crinkling with a knowing maternal warmth as she carefully pruned a row of flowering medicinal herbs. She didn't offer a polite greeting or pretend to ignore the flushed, visibly shaken state I was currently trapped in, opting instead to speak with a piercing honesty. Without missing a single deliberate snip of her shears, Maeve began to unravel the dark, bloody history surrounding the terrifying male who currently held my entire world in his massive, scarred hands. Her voice was a low, steady murmur as she painted a horrifying picture of a brutal uprising against a vicious, sadistic tyrant who had once ruled the Silverfang territory with absolute cruelty. Maddox had been forced to become a lethal weapon to save his people, leading a desperate, violent rebellion that ultimately secured their freedom, but permanently shattered his own peace. The jagged, vicious scar tearing across his jawline wasn't a mark of aggression or a trophy of dominance. It was the agonizing price he paid to rip a killing blow away from the young Omega he had thrown his massive body in front of. Maeve's sorrowful eyes met mine, revealing that the king remained utterly convinced his traumatized, monstrous nature made him completely unfit to hold the delicate light of a gentle mate. The devastating revelation stripped away the final stubborn layers of my defensive armor, leaving me completely emotionally exposed and painfully raw. Every terrifying assumption I had built around his brooding silence violently collapsed, replaced by a fierce, deeply protective ache that blossomed brilliantly in the center of my chest. I finally understood that the towering, terrifying Alpha King was actually a profoundly wounded male, drowning in a sea of self-hatred and desperately starving for a single drop of unconditional acceptance. A profound paradigm shift realigned my entire reality. I utterly erasing the frightened refugee from Lagos and replacing her with a fiercely devoted mate ready to fight for her king. Armed with this staggering new truth, I abandoned the humid sanctuary of the greenhouse and deliberately marched toward the freezing training grounds located in the central courtyard. I could hear the rhythmic, thunderous strikes of heavy weaponry echoing against the ancient stone walls long before I stepped out into the biting winter wind. Maddox was a magnificent blur of raw, lethal power. His massive torso bared to the freezing air as he brutally dismantled a series of heavy wooden training dummies with terrifying precision. His muscles bunched and flexed with an ultra-realistic cinematic grace, sweat glistening across the deep planes of his back despite the freezing temperature, sending a fresh, blinding jolt of desire straight through my core. I didn't shrink back into the shadows or attempt to mask my presence, refusing to be the terrified, trembling captive any longer. Moving with a deliberate, unwavering purpose, I walked directly to a nearby water barrel, filling a simple wooden cup before stepping out onto the frost-covered stones of the training ring. Maddox sensed my approach instantly, freezing his lethal swing in midair with a breathtaking display of physical restraint before turning to face me. His massive chest heaved with exertion, his golden eyes widening in a fraction of a second as he registered my bold, entirely unprompted entrance into his violent domain. The heavy silence stretched out between us, but it was no longer a suffocating cage of fear. It was a crackling electric wire vibrating with an intense, an unspoken reverence. I stepped directly into his personal space, completely ignoring the sharp scent of his exertion, and gently extended my hand to offer the wooden cup. Maddox stared at the simple vessel as if it were a priceless, fragile artifact, his heavily calloused fingers trembling slightly as he reached out to accept it. His massive hand brushed against my knuckles, sending a scorching wave of heat shooting up my arm as his golden eyes lifted to meet mine with an expression of absolute, devastating awe. He looked at me as though I had personally hung the moon and scattered the stars, a completely unguarded look of worship that brought hot tears stinging to the corners of my eyes. I held his intense, burning gaze softly, ensuring he could read the total absence of fear in my expression. I silently vowing to dismantle every insecurity haunting his noble heart. The lingering brush of our fingers ignited a chaotic, entirely consuming fire deep within my belly, entirely changing the fundamental nature of our unspoken bond. I was no longer merely reacting to his overwhelming physical presence. My entire body was fiercely, actively craving his touch, desperate to explore the magnificent beast standing before me. The simmering heat between us was no longer a one-sided war of silent protection. It was a raging fire, and I was finally ready to burn. Chapter 9. The Heartbeat. The fortress was bathed in the deep quiet blue of a mountain midnight by the time I finally gathered the courage to leave the safety of my plush chambers. The profound, so world-altering revelation I had experienced earlier in the training courtyard still vibrated fiercely through my veins, a relentless current of newfound understanding that made the very concept of sleep completely impossible. I navigated the labyrinthine stone corridors, guided only by the flickering dying glow of the wall sconces, my bare feet making absolutely no sound against the heavy woven rugs. I was no longer running away from the terrifying Alpha King who had silently claimed me. I was deliberately hunting him down, desperately determined to bridge the agonizing gap his deep-seated insecurities had violently forced between us. I found him exactly where I knew he would be, isolated inside his sprawling private study, located at the very edge of the royal wing. The heavy oak door was left slightly ajar, allowing the rich, as deeply intoxicating scent of burning cedar, crushed winter mint, and old dry parchment to spill out into the freezing hallway. I slipped cautiously through the narrow opening, pausing in the deep shadows near the entrance to watch the magnificent beast I was permanently bound to. Maddox was slouched heavily over a massive mahogany table strewn with heavy territorial maps, his staggering broad frame looking profoundly exhausted under the warm golden light of a single flickering candelabra. He had traded his heavy, rigid battle leathers for a simple, loose-fitting linen shirt, exposing the thick cords of raw muscle in his neck and the devastatingly broad expanse of his shoulders. The deep, heavy silence of the room was punctuated only by the soft crackle of the dying hearth fire and the slightly ragged, uneven rhythm of his exhausted breathing. My heart contracted painfully in my chest as I studied the harsh, weary lines bracketing his mouth and the agonizing way his massive fingers rubbed tiredly at his temples. He looked entirely like a male carrying the crushing weight of a shattered world entirely on his own, completely unaware that he finally had an equal ready to fiercely share the devastating burden. I took a slow, deliberate step out of the deep shadows, the soft rustle of my nightgown instantly shattering the quiet isolation of his secluded sanctuary. Maddox went completely rigid, his massive shoulders locking into rigid stone as his head snapped up, his golden eyes instantly finding my trembling form in the dim light. He didn't speak, and he didn't rise from his heavy wooden chair, yet the sheer, overwhelming magnetic pull radiating from his massive body dragged me relentlessly across the room. Every defensive instinct I possessed screamed that I was walking directly into the center of a raging, uncontrollable inferno, but my feet continued moving forward until I was standing merely inches away from the edge of his heavy table. The intense, molten heat of his gaze burned straight through the thin fabric of my clothing, dropping the freezing ambient temperature of the room into total irrelevance. He watched my approach with the breathless, terrified focus of a starving man being offered a magnificent feast he firmly believed he was forever forbidden to touch. I could see the agonizing restraint violently vibrating through his colossal frame. His jaw clenched so tightly, the vicious scar carving across his cheek stood out in stark, terrifying relief. He deliberately forced his calloused hands flat against the mahogany surface of the desk, physically anchoring his staggering strength to the wood to prevent his terrifying primal instincts from taking over and dragging me across the surface. Taking a deep, fortifying breath that filled my lungs entirely with his intoxicating winter mint scent, I rounded the corner of the heavy table and stepped squarely between his spread knees. Maddox inhaled sharply, a fractured, broken sound that echoed loudly in the quiet study. But he remained completely frozen, granting me absolute, unwavering control over the terrifyingly intimate physical interaction. I slowly raised my trembling right hand, my fingertips hovering just a fraction of an inch above the center of his chest, feeling the overwhelming, unradiant heat pouring off his skin. He closed his golden eyes tightly, his heavily muscled chest rising to meet my hand in a desperate, microscopic movement of pure, unadulterated longing. With a silent prayer to whatever fate had tied our souls permanently together, I pressed my palm flat against the warm linen covering his heart, completely breaking the terrifying physical isolation he had trapped himself inside. A violent, full-body shudder instantly ripped through his massive frame, his head dropping backward as a ragged, profoundly vulnerable sigh finally escaped his slightly parted lips. Beneath my pressing hand, I could feel the frantic, thunderous galloping of his heartbeat, a wild, unrestrained rhythm that completely betrayed the calm, stoic facade he was desperately trying to maintain. A booming thud against my palm was a deafening confession of his overwhelming devotion, a physical manifestation of a love so profound it practically vibrated through the ancient floorboards. The agonizingly intimate contact dissolved the final stubborn walls of my resistance, lighting a scorching fire low in my belly that fiercely demanded a much deeper, entirely consuming connection. Maddox slowly brought his own trembling hand up to cover mine, pressing my palm even tighter against his racing heart, while his blazing golden eyes locked onto my lips with a dark, consuming hunger. The sheer, overwhelming power of his desire washed over me in devastating torrential waves, making it brutally obvious exactly how desperately he wanted to wrap his massive arms around my waist and violently claim my mouth. Yet, permanently anchored by his devastating fear of frightening me away, he stubbornly remained frozen in his chair, leaving us trapped on the razor's edge of a suffocating tension because he absolutely refused to move first. Trapped directly between his knees, I could feel the violent, desperate pounding of his heart, leaving us entirely paralyzed on the edge of a kiss he was far too terrified to take. Chapter 10. The Open Door. The heavy oak door of Maddox's quarters clicked shut, sealing us in a world composed entirely of his intoxicating scent, a rich blend of petrichor, pine needles, and the musky heat of his skin. Every breath drew him deeper into my lungs, settling a wild energy in my bones while my heart hammered against my ribs. The fire crackling in the hearth cast golden shadows across the sharp planes of his face, illuminating the bottomless intensity in his eyes. There was no distance left between us, only charged air humming with the inevitability of our bond, pressing us closer until I felt the radiant warmth of his frame seeping through my dress. His calloused hands framed my face, thumbs brushing my cheekbones with a reverence that stole the breath from my throat. The predatory edge of his wolf was right beneath the surface, a simmering force I felt in the tremor of his fingers and the heavy cadence of his breathing. My body responded on instinct, leaning into his touch and melting against his solid chest as a desperate ache bloomed low in my stomach. I wanted the absolute certainty of his mark to anchor me to him, and I knew with every fiber of my being that his wolf was howling for that exact same release. Yet, just as my lips parted to invite the kiss I was starving for, Maddox's jaw clenched tightly and he deliberately stepped backward. The sudden loss of his body heat was a physical blow, leaving my skin prickling with cold as I searched his strained features for an explanation. He didn't look at my lips, nor did he let his gaze drop to my fluttering pulse. Instead, he turned his back to me and walked steadily toward the door. His hand wrapped around the iron handle, pulling it wide open to reveal the moonlit corridor, allowing the night breeze to sweep into the stifling warmth of the room. The emotional gravity of what he was doing hit me with the force of a tidal wave. In our world, a dominant wolf driven by the mating frenzy did not simply back away. Nor did they ever willingly provide an escape route to the mate their instincts screamed to claim. Maddox was suppressing the most primal urges of his nature, fighting a brutal internal war just to ensure I knew I was not a prisoner to this bond. This was his ultimate proof of respect, a silent declaration that my autonomy mattered far more to him than his own desperate desires. Tears pricked my eyes as I looked from the open doorway back to the man who stood rigidly beside it, his chest heaving with the effort of holding himself still. I didn't need to walk out that door to know I was free, because his willingness to let me go had just tethered my soul to his more securely than any physical mark. Closing the distance between us with deliberate steps, I reached out and gently laid my hand over his, where it gripped the edge of the heavy wood. Without a single spoken word, I pushed the door shut, locking us inside once more, before turning to press my mouth softly against his racing pulse in a silent vow of surrender. Before his arms could wrap around me to seal the promise, the sudden deafening toll of the pack square bell shattered the quiet of the room. The harsh clanging echoed through the timber walls, a summons from the elder council that no member of the pack could ignore without facing severe consequences. Maddox's eyes darkened with immediate frustration, his jaw locking tight as he rested his forehead against mine for one grounding second, an unspoken apology passing between us. He threaded his fingers securely through mine, anchoring me to his side as we left the sanctuary of his room and walked out into the unforgiving reality of the corridors. The council chamber was an ancient, cavernous room built from dark stone, smelling heavily of burning sage, old parchment, and the stifling weight of absolute authority. Hundreds of pack members crowded the outer edges, their collective gaze burning into my skin as Maddox led me straight into the center of the sunken floor. The silence that fell over the massive room was absolute and suffocating, thick with anticipation as the head elder, a formidable woman with silver hair, stood to address us. She did not look at Maddox. Her intense, critical glare was fixed entirely on me, replacing the lingering warmth of the bedroom with a cold, terrifying reality. The ancient laws require a public declaration of the mating bond to solidify your place beside our alpha. The head elder's voice boomed, bouncing sharply off the stone walls. You stand before this council as an outsider, and therefore you must formally, unequivocally state your intention to accept this bond, pledging your life to this territory. I squeezed Maddox's hand, drawing strength from the unyielding solidity of his grip, and let my voice ring out clear and unwavering as I declared my choice to stand by him. Relief washed over me for a fleeting second, but it was instantly crushed when the elder's expression hardened into a cold, merciless mask. Your acceptance has been noted, but the ancient rites are absolutely explicit regarding the completion of a leadership bond, she stated coldly, turning her piercing gaze toward the man standing silently at my side. The law demands that the alpha must verbally accept his mate before the assembled pack, speaking the sacred vows of claiming loud enough for the ancestors to bear witness. The collective gasp from the surrounding pack members sucked the remaining oxygen from the room, leaving me staring in absolute suffocating horror at the high seat. They were demanding a verbal confirmation, a spoken vow of devotion, from a man whose vocal cords had been brutally, irreversibly severed years ago. They demanded a spoken vow to seal our bond, a seemingly simple request that was completely impossible for my silent alpha. Chapter 11. The Razor's Edge. The suffocating silence of the council chamber pressed against my skin, cold and heavy, as the elders waited for an impossible sound. Maddox didn't flinch. His grip on my hand remained a warm, unyielding anchor, while his furious gaze swept across the high seats. Instead of entertaining their cruel demand, he reached into his jacket, pulled out a lethal silver ceremonial dagger, and sliced a clean line across his palm before pressing his bleeding hand directly over my heart. The ancient blood vow, a rite far older and far more sacred than any spoken word, flared through the room as a physical wave of heat, forcing the elders to avert their eyes in submission. He didn't wait for their stammered apologies or sudden backpedaling. He simply turned on his heel and pulled me from the stifling cavern, his long strides eating up the distance back to his private quarters. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind us for the second time that night, the freezing tension of the council chamber dissolved into a thick, suffocating heat. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting a deep molten orange light over the sharp, strained lines of his jaw and the rigid set of his shoulders. I could smell the sharp metallic tang of his blood mingling with the rich, intoxicating scent of pine and petrichor, a combination that sent a wild, primal shiver down my spine. His chest was heaving, the sheer force of his suppressed anger and raging desire warring visibly beneath the fabric of his dark shirt. I stepped closer, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, desperate to soothe the furious storm that the elders had ignited within him. Maddox caught my wrists before I could reach his chest, his calloused fingers wrapping around my delicate bones with a grip that was infinitely gentle yet impossibly firm. He shook his head slowly, his dark eyes burning with a desperate, agonizing fire that communicated exactly how much effort it was taking to keep me at arm's length. The council's attempt to force our bond had violated something sacred to him, and I suddenly understood that he refused to let our claiming be tainted by their demands or his own feral instincts. He needed this to be a choice, a conscious, deliberate, and undeniably mutual surrender that existed entirely outside the suffocating expectations of the pack. His thumbs stroked the racing pulse points at my wrists, grounding us both in the agonizingly slow, deliberate reality of this moment, proving that his respect for my agency outweighed his burning need to claim. Stepping back just enough to break the magnetic pull of our bodies, he lifted his hands, his long, graceful fingers moving through the fluid motions of the sign language we had been practicing. I will not take you in anger, and I will not take you in silence. His hands signed, the elegant gestures contrasting sharply with the raw, ragged edge of his breathing. Tell me what you want. I need to hear the words from your lips, entirely for me, not for them. A tremor rocked through my core at the sheer intensity of his demand, the realization that he was placing the ultimate power of our intimacy squarely in my hands. The heavy silence of the room waited for my voice, amplifying the sounds of our harsh breaths and the frantic echoing beats of my own racing heart. But the air between us was thick enough to drown in as I looked up into the bottomless depths of his eyes, seeing the absolute vulnerability hiding beneath his predatory stillness. I want you, Maddox, I whispered, the words trembling on my lips before I gathered my courage and spoke them with the unwavering conviction he deserved. Not because of a blood vow, not because of the elders, and not because of a primal instinct I can't control. I want you because you are the man who sacrifices his own desires to keep me safe, and I am choosing to give myself to you completely. The profound relief that washed over his features was devastating, fracturing his ironclad control and replacing it with a hungry, desperate devotion that made my knees go weak. He eliminated the distance between us in a single fluid stride, his large hands sinking into my hair and tilting my head back to expose the sensitive curve of my throat. The searing heat of his mouth brushed against my jawline, a tantalizing whisper of contact that sent a violent jolt of electricity straight down to my toes. I arched into his touch, a soft, involuntary moan escaping my lips. But he expertly shifted his angle, denying me the full weight of his kiss as his lips traced a torturous, agonizingly slow path down to my collarbone. His restraint was a beautiful, agonizing weapon, pushing my body to the absolute brink of madness, as every nerve ending caught fire under his deliberate, worshipful attention. The friction of our bodies pressing together, separated only by the maddening barrier of our clothes, ignited a reckless, desperate fire in my blood that demanded immediate satisfaction. So my fingers tangled in the soft material of his shirt, tugging fiercely, as a strangled, impatient sob tore itself from the back of my throat. Maddox released a heavy, chest-rattling exhale that vibrated straight through my skin and shattered the very last remnants of his civilized restraint. He swept me into his arms with terrifying, exhilarating speed. The sheer power of his hold, promising a collision that would completely obliterate the world outside these walls. The mattress hit my back with a soft thud, but as his large hands gripped my hips and his heavy frame settled completely over mine, I knew this breathtaking impact was only the beginning of our absolute ruin. His legendary restraint finally snapped, and as his heavy frame pinned me to the mattress, there was no turning back from the breathless storm we were about to unleash. Chapter 12. Blood and Devotion. The breathless weight of Maddox pressing me into the mattress was a promise of absolute ruin. A heavy blanket of heat that made my skin flush and my heart race with intoxicating anticipation. His mouth was a scorching brand against the sensitive skin of my neck, mapping a slow, deliberate path of exquisite agony that made the rest of the cold, demanding world completely fade away. We were suspended in a perfect, fragile bubble of mutual surrender, every nerve ending in my body screaming for the release only he could provide. But before my trembling hands could pull him entirely against me, the explosive shatter of the reinforced glass window tore violently through the heavy silence of the bedroom. Shards of jagged, moonlight-caught glass rained across the wooden floorboards like deadly hail, all accompanied instantly by the foul, rotting stench of rogue wolves that immediately poisoned the rich, comforting scent of his pine and petrichor. The transition from a worshipful, tender lover to a completely lethal predator was instantaneous, a terrifyingly beautiful shift that stole the breath right out of my lungs. Maddox tore himself away from me in a fraction of a second, his massive frame shifting effortlessly to shield my vulnerable body from the sudden onslaught of freezing night air and the three monstrous figures vaulting through the ruined window. The intruders were massive, their eyes completely vacant, and their muzzles dripping with a rabid, unnatural foam that spoke of dark magic and absolute, uncontrollable madness. A low, guttural snarl vibrated from deep within Maddox's chest. Yuka's sound so entirely feral and uncompromising that it resonated deep within the marrow of my bones. He didn't hesitate for a single heartbeat to analyze the overwhelming odds, launching himself directly at the largest intruder with the devastating, unyielding force of a completely unchained beast. The violence that erupted in the center of the moonlit bedroom was a brutal, dizzying blur of lethal power and uncompromising savagery that I could barely track with my eyes. I pressed my back hard against the solid oak headboard, my breath catching painfully in my throat as I watched the very man who had just touched me with such agonizing reverence turn into an absolute weapon of mass destruction. Maddox fought with a ruthless, highly calculated grace, his bare hands snapping thick bones and tearing through heavily muscled flesh with a sickening wet crunch that echoed over the deafening, frantic snarls of the rogues. He was a monster in the dark, a terrifying force of nature, painting the expensive floorboards crimson with every calculated strike, yet not a single drop of fear existed in my racing heart. I saw the desperate, all-consuming need to protect me fueling every devastating blow, realizing profoundly that his capacity for extreme violence was directly proportional to the staggering depth of his devotion. Within mere minutes, the chaotic, bloody struggle abruptly ended, leaving a suffocating, heavy silence in its wake that was broken only by the ragged, harsh sounds of my alpha's breathing. He stood completely still amidst the absolute ruin of his private chambers, his broad chest heaving violently as the metallic copper stench of fresh blood mixed heavily with the crisp night wind howling relentlessly through the shattered window. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he turned his head to face me, his dark eyes wide and completely stripped of their usual guarded stoicism, revealing the frightened man buried beneath the warrior. He looked down at his blood-soaked hands and then looked back up at my face, a heartbreaking, raw vulnerability flashing across his striking features as he waited in agony for me to recoil in horror. He fully expected me to see the irredeemable monster the elders always claimed him to be, silently waiting for me to shrink away from the brutal, uncompromising darkness that he had just unleashed to keep me breathing. I didn't hesitate for a single second. Pushing myself off the edge of the mattress and walking deliberately across the glass-strewn floor toward the terrifying blood-drenched predator who completely owned my soul. The air surrounding his massive frame practically vibrated with dangerous residual violence, a chaotic electric energy that made the tiny hairs on my arms stand straight up as I closed the physical distance between us. Reaching out with purposeful movement, I placed my trembling hands flat against his heaving, blood-stained chest, feeling the frantic, echoing thunder of his heart hammering desperately against my palms. I didn't flinch away from the sticky warmth of the blood coating his skin, nor did I shy away from the feral, dangerous edge still lingering in the sharp set of his clenched jaw. "You are my protector," I whispered fiercely into the quiet room, locking my gaze firmly with his to ensure he saw the absolute, unconditional acceptance burning brightly in my eyes. "There is no part of you that I fear, Maddox, not the gentle light, and absolutely never the brutal dark." A shuddering gasp tore painfully through his throat, a completely unguarded sound of profound, world-altering relief that broke my heart and stitched it back together in the exact same second. He dropped his forehead heavily against mine, his bloody hands hovering awkwardly, inches from my waist, as if he was absolutely terrified of staining my skin with the gruesome evidence of his brutality. I closed the agonizing gap for him, wrapping my arms tight around his thick neck and anchoring him firmly to my body, letting the intoxicating cocktail of our mingled scents and the adrenaline of survival completely wash over us both. The sudden, violent danger of the night had completely stripped away any remaining illusions of patience, leaving behind a raw, unfiltered need that burned 10 times hotter than it had just moments before the attack. He scooped me securely into his massive arms without making a single sound, carrying me swiftly out of the ruined bedroom and moving with purposeful strides down the hidden, heavily fortified corridors toward the impenetrable heart of the fortress. The heavy steel door of the inner sanctuary slammed solidly shut behind us, the automatic deadbolts engaging with a resounding metallic clack that safely sealed us away from the violence and the chaos of the outside world. The secure room was cloaked in shadows, lit only by the faint pulsing red glow of the emergency lights. But I didn't need to see his face clearly to feel the suffocating, demanding intensity rolling off his massive frame in waves. He set me down gently on my feet, but his large hands immediately locked securely onto my hips, pulling me flush against the rigid, burning wall of his chest with a possessive groan. The fading adrenaline of the life-or-death struggle was rapidly boiling over, completely mutating into the agonizing physical frustration that had been relentlessly torturing our bodies all night. His chest pressed heavily and insistently against mine as his head dipped low in the darkness, and the raw, breathless hunger radiating from his body guaranteed that our imminent collision would completely shatter us both. Locked inside the impenetrable darkness of the sanctuary, the adrenaline of survival completely shattered the last of our restraint, guaranteeing a collision that would change us forever. Chapter 13. Touching the Scar. The suffocating darkness of the inner sanctuary was a stark contrast to the chaotic moonlight of the ruined bedroom we had just fled, illuminated only by the pulsing red glow of the emergency lights. Every breath Maddox took was a ragged pull of air that expanded his massive chest against mine, radiating a furnace-like heat that seeped into my shivering bones. The metallic tang of fresh blood and the grounding scent of rain-soaked pine saturated the small, reinforced room, wrapping around us like an inescapable cocoon. His trembling hands tightened their possessive grip on my waist, I pulling me, flush against the rigid lines of his body, until the frantic beats of our hearts became a single rhythm. We were consumed by the volatile aftermath of survival, the adrenaline of the brutal fight mutating into a desperate hunger that demanded absolute satisfaction. With a raw, soundless groan vibrating deep within his chest, Maddox lowered his head and captured my lips in a searing kiss that obliterated whatever fragile restraint he had left. There was nothing gentle about the way his mouth moved against mine. It was a devastatingly thorough claiming, fueled by the terrifying realization of how close we had come to losing everything. I tasted the salt of his sweat and the intoxicating dark spice of his unique essence, a combination that sent a wild current surging fiercely through my veins. Then my fingers tangled desperately into the thick strands of his hair, anchoring myself to him as his tongue swept past my parted lips, deepening the kiss until the heavy steel walls completely faded away. He devoured my breath and gave me his in return, a flawless exchange of life that grounded my senses and ignited a roaring inferno low in my stomach. As the frantic urgency of our initial collision began to slow into a mesmerizing rhythm, my hands drifted down from his hair to trace the strong, tense line of his jaw. The faint red glow of the room cast shifting shadows across his striking features, highlighting the unadulterated reverence burning in his dark eyes as he pulled back just enough to look at me. It was in that quiet space between heartbeats that my fingertips brushed against the thick, unraised line of jagged skin wrapping brutally across the front of his throat. The terrible scar was a permanent monument to the unspeakable violence he had endured, the exact physical location where his ability to verbally claim his mate had been irreversibly severed. My breath hitched as the rough texture of the old wound met my skin, a profound wave of protective, heartbreaking love crashing heavily over my soul. The moment my fingers deliberately traced the length of the ruined tissue, Maddox went terrifyingly still, his broad shoulders locking into a rigid posture of defensive anticipation. A sudden vulnerability fractured the intense desire in his gaze, replaced by a silent terror that I would recoil from the ugliest piece of his past. He had spent his entire adult life hiding this specific wound behind high collars and a terrifying reputation, building impenetrable emotional walls to prevent anyone from seeing the helpless victim he had once been. But I didn't see weakness in the jagged ridges of his scar. I saw the breathtaking resilience of a man who had survived the darkest hell and still possessed the capacity to love with absolute purity. My thumb stroked gently over the damaged skin, an intentional motion designed to silently communicate that I embraced every single fractured piece of his complex soul. Maintaining unbroken, soul-bearing eye contact with him, I leaned forward and pressed my lips softly against the center of his scarred throat, sealing my silent promise with the warmth of my mouth. The impact of that single touch was utterly catastrophic to his ironclad defenses, violently shattering the final emotional barricades he had spent years meticulously constructing around his heart. A jagged, completely soundless sob tore through his chest, vibrating violently against my lips as the rigid tension instantly drained from his massive frame, leaving him beautifully unguarded in my arms. He dropped his forehead heavily against my shoulder, his large hands shaking uncontrollably as they slid up my back to crush me against him with an overwhelming gratitude. In the profound silence of that reinforced room, his wordless surrender spoke louder than any spoken vow ever could, cementing the unbreakable bond tethering our souls together. See, the crushing emotional intimacy of the moment rapidly reignited the roaring physical fire between us, transforming his gentle embrace into a frantic exploration of my trembling body. His hands were everywhere at once, sweeping down the curve of my spine and gripping my hips to lift me effortlessly, forcing me to wrap my legs securely around his waist as he backed me against the cold steel wall. I gasped sharply as the friction of his heavy body, pressing deeply against my aching center, sent blinding flashes of exquisite pleasure radiating through every single nerve ending. The maddening barrier of our clothing felt like an intolerable punishment, and my eager hands tore frantically at his ruined shirt, desperate to feel his burning bare skin flush against mine. We were entirely consumed by the breathless descent into ultimate surrender. He is hovering agonizingly on the absolute edge of a physical union that would irrevocably alter our destinies. Maddox pressed his scorching mouth against the sensitive skin beneath my ear, his hips rolling forward in a deliberate promise of the absolute ruin he was about to deliver. Every muscle in my body pulled taut like an overdrawn bowstring, my mind entirely vacant of anything except the suffocating heat of his skin and the primal demand for release. He shifted his grip on my thighs, adjusting our alignment with a dark intent that perfectly signaled the exact moment we would finally cross the point of no return. But just as I arched my spine to welcome the magnificent weight of his full claim, a sudden, deafening shriek of the fortress's emergency warning horn violently shattered the heavy silence. The piercing, a mechanical wail ripped ruthlessly through our private sanctuary, dragging us out of our euphoric haze and screaming the horrifying reality that the war had finally breached our walls. Just as the last of our defenses shattered and we stood on the absolute edge of surrender, the deafening scream of the fortress sirens dragged us violently back into a brutal war. Chapter 14. The Yielding. The deafening mechanical shriek of the fortress's emergency horn was a physical blow that brutally severed the magnetic pull between our bodies. The transition from a suffocating, euphoric heat to the freezing reality of imminent death left me completely disoriented, gasping for the oxygen that had just been violently stolen from my lungs. Maddox ripped himself away from my trembling form in a single jerky motion, the sudden absence of his massive weight leaving an agonizing void that made my skin ache in protest. The pulsing red emergency lights painted the harsh, defensive lines of his naked torso in sinister shadows, highlighting the immediate, terrifying return of the impenetrable emotional walls he had just allowed me to shatter. The intoxicating scent of his arousal and our mingled breath was instantly overpowered by the sharp, acidic tang of his sudden, overwhelming panic, a scent so deeply rooted in despair that it made my eyes water. He stepped backward until his spine hit the opposite steel wall, his broad chest heaving violently, as his dark eyes locked onto mine with an expression of unadulterated devastation. I could see the dark, toxic gears of his deep-seated insecurities grinding together, on instantly twisting the breathtaking vulnerability of our shared intimacy into a weapon of self-loathing. He looked down at his blood-stained hands, the gruesome evidence of the violence he had just committed to keep me breathing, and then looked back up at me as if he were suddenly nothing more than a monster. The beautiful, fragile trust we had painstakingly forged was evaporating right in front of my eyes, replaced entirely by his tragic belief that he was fundamentally unworthy of the pure devotion I had offered. He was convinced that the blaring alarm was a direct punishment for his brief moment of selfish desire, a brutal reminder that a fractured, voiceless alpha could never provide a safe haven for a mate. Before I could force my trembling legs to carry me across the room and physically shake the terrible assumptions from his head, Maddox raised his hands to speak. His long, graceful fingers, still stained with the copper-scented blood of our attackers, moved through the fluid motions of sign language with a terrifying finality. Gideon has breached the walls, his hands communicated, the elegant gestures slicing sharply through the chaotic wail of the sirens. The pack will be slaughtered if they fight for a broken leader. I will end this before he reaches you. The agonizing weight of what he was actually saying hit me with the destructive force of a runaway train, completely obliterating my shattered composure. He was not just planning to face his lethal rival in combat, he was planning to walk out into the courtyard and officially yield his territory and his life in a misguided attempt to buy my safety. The sheer tragedy of his monumental sacrifice was suffocating. A heartbreaking reflection of how completely his past trauma had warped his understanding of his own undeniable worth. He honestly believed that the ultimate expression of his love was to step aside and let a cruel tyrant take control, entirely convinced that I would be better off under the protection of a speaking alpha than tied to his violent, silent existence. "No, Maddox, absolutely not," I sobbed, my voice cracking under the crushing weight of panic as I launched myself forward to grab his solid wrists. "You do not get to make this choice for me, and you do not get to throw your life away because you think you are broken." But my frantic, tear-soaked words simply bounced off the impenetrable armor of his resolve, his mind already consumed by the tragic role of the sacrificial martyr. He firmly untangled my desperately clinging fingers from his wrists, his touch so excruciatingly tender that it felt like he was physically extracting my heart from my chest. Moving with the terrifying calm of a man walking to his own execution, he reached for his discarded shirt and pulled it slowly over his broad, scarred shoulders. The heavy metallic scent of his impending doom completely saturated the small space, choking the remaining air from my lungs as he paused in the open doorway to look back at me one final time. His dark eyes were bottomless pools of agonizing sorrow and unconditional love, silently memorizing the exact contours of my face before he deliberately sealed his fractured soul away behind a mask of unyielding stone. He raised one hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to his own palm, and then reached out to briefly cup the empty air between us. A devastating goodbye that completely shattered the remaining pieces of my world. The heavy steel door slammed shut with a deafening metallic clang that echoed loudly over the blaring alarm, the automatic deadbolts instantly locking from the outside and trapping me within the safety of the reinforced sanctuary. I threw myself against the impenetrable metal, my fists pounding relentlessly against the cold surface as I screamed his name until my vocal cords burned and tore. But the only answer I received was the mocking, mechanical wail of the fortress sirens. My frantic, terrified mind raced through the brutal reality of the ancient laws, I calculating the agonizingly short distance between the inner sanctuary and the central courtyard where Gideon would be waiting for the slaughter. A formal yielding was immediate, irrevocable, and entirely lethal, meaning the man who owned every single piece of my soul was actively walking into a brutal execution that he had absolutely no intention of fighting. The adrenaline that had previously fueled our passionate surrender was now completely mutated into a violent, clawing desperation, a primal need to break through the steel and save my mate from his own tragic nobility. I began frantically tearing through the small emergency supply cabinets lining the walls of the bunker, my trembling hands searching wildly for anything heavy enough or sharp enough to destroy the reinforced locking mechanism. The metallic scent of blood and terror spurred my movements into a frenzied, chaotic blur, my every thought consumed entirely by the terrifying ticking clock counting down the remaining seconds of his life. I had less than 5 minutes to shatter this steel door, fight my way through an army of enemy wolves, and stop the only man I would ever love from throwing his beautiful life away. Trapped behind a reinforced steel door, I had only minutes to break out and stop the man I loved from willingly walking into his own execution. Chapter 15. Finding Her Voice. The unforgiving steel of the sanctuary door bit deeply into my bruised hands as I clawed desperately at the reinforced locking mechanism, my fingernails scraping against the unyielding metal until they bled. In the pulsing crimson glare of the emergency lights bathed the claustrophobic space in a nightmare hue, matching the frantic, terrified rhythm of my racing heart as it hammered relentlessly against my ribs. The mechanical wail of the sirens continued to drill ruthlessly into my skull, a maddening, high-pitched countdown to the horrific execution my noble mate was willfully marching toward in the courtyard. Every ragged breath I drew pulled the lingering, intoxicating scent of his pine and petrichor deep into my lungs, a cruel, invisible phantom of the profound intimacy we had shared mere moments ago. I refused to let the heavy metallic scent of his resignation be the last thing he ever gave me, channeling my overwhelming panic into a singular, laser-focused mission to completely shatter my cage. My frantic and tear-blinded search through the dim, chaotic shadows of the bunker finally yielded a heavy iron pry bar that had been discarded carelessly beneath a dusty pile of emergency rations. The cold, textured metal felt like a miraculous lifeline against my trembling, sweat-slicked palms, grounding my rapidly spiraling thoughts as I wedged the blunt edge violently into the narrow seam of the steel door. With a primal, feral scream that painfully tore at the raw edges of my throat, I threw my entire body weight against the iron lever, fighting a brutal, agonizing battle of leverage against the fortress's ancient security. My muscles screamed in loud protest, burning intensely with the fiery buildup of lactic acid. But the excruciating physical pain was completely dwarfed by the crushing emotional revelation blossoming furiously within my chest. Maddox honestly believed his silence and his terrible scars made him inherently broken. But as I battled the unyielding steel, I realized with absolute clarity that his perceived flaws were exactly why my soul had recognized his. I loved him entirely, not in spite of the jagged, ruined tissue across his throat, or the suffocating, violent darkness he carried within his spirit, but fiercely and unconditionally because of those very things. He had endured the most unimaginable, brutal trauma to protect his pack from a devastating threat, sacrificing his own voice and his own peace of mind to become a terrifying, impenetrable shield for those who could not fight. His heartbreaking inability to speak the sacred mating vows wasn't a tragic failure of his character. It was a profound, enduring proof of the staggering depth of his loyalty and the unyielding, magnificent strength of his spirit. I didn't need a perfectly pristine vocal alpha who could stand proudly before the Elder Council and recite ancient, meaningless words to validate the eternal, fiery bond tethering our two souls together in the dark. I desperately needed the man who had deliberately sliced his own palm to offer me a silent blood vow in a room full of enemies, the selfless protector who valued my personal autonomy far above his own agonizing desires. With a final agonizing heave, fueled by the sheer terrifying magnitude of my unconditional love, the heavy deadbolts surrendered with a deafening metallic snap that rang like a massive gunshot in the confined space. The heavy steel door groaned loudly in ultimate defeat, swinging outward on its reinforced hinges to reveal a dark, smoke-filled corridor that reeked overwhelmingly of burning timber, raw ozone, and the coppery stench of freshly spilled blood. I didn't hesitate for a single precious fraction of a second, sprinting blindly into the suffocating, toxic haze as the chaotic, terrifying symphony of a full-scale siege reverberated violently through the trembling stone floors beneath my feet. The agonizing howls of shifting wolves and the brutal metallic clash of silver weaponry served as a morbid, terrifying compass, guiding my desperate, frantic footsteps through the labyrinthine halls toward the central pack square. My lungs burned furiously with a harsh intake of thick smoke, and my bare feet slipped dangerously on the slick, blood-stained flagstones. But I simply pushed my aching body harder, terrified that I was already a lifetime too late to save him. My racing internal monologue easily drowned out the deafening, horrific chaos of the brutal war raging around me, crystallizing into a single unbreakable vow that I would scream at the top of my lungs the moment I finally found him. He had spent his entire adult life entirely convinced that his tragic silence made him inherently unworthy of claiming a true mate. So I was going to become the relentless, uncompromising voice that championed his beautiful, fractured soul to the entire world. I would boldly and publicly claim the lethal predator, the silent, brooding warrior, and the breathtakingly gentle lover, completely binding my own destiny to his completely ruined edges until he finally understood that he was entirely perfect in my eyes. Bursting violently through the heavy, shattered oak doors that led to the open pack square, the sudden blast of freezing, ash-filled night air felt like a brutal physical slap against my overheated, sweat-slicked skin. The sprawling courtyard was a horrific swirling vortex of bloody violence and primal despair, illuminated by the harsh, flickering orange light of raging fires that rapidly consumed the ancient timber structures along the fortress perimeter. My panicked, tear-filled gaze swept desperately across the chaotic sea of brutal combatants, frantically filtering out the massive, snarling beasts and dying warriors until my eyes finally locked onto a tense clearing in the very center of the absolute madness. The precious air in my lungs turned instantly to solid ice, freezing my desperate, agonizing scream right in my throat as I suddenly spotted Maddox's broad, familiar silhouette standing entirely alone amidst a tight circle of bristling enemy wolves. He was directly facing Gideon, the massive, cruel rival whose dark eyes burned with a sickening, triumphant malice that sent a nauseating wave of absolute revulsion violently churning through my trembling gut. Maddox had completely lowered his normally lethal guard. His massive, scarred shoulders slumped forward in a posture of deliberate, tragic surrender as he looked away from his gloating enemy and stared completely blankly at the blood-soaked earth beneath his boots. The terrifying, undeniable reality of his misguided, noble sacrifice slammed into my chest with devastating, paralyzing force, freezing my limbs as I watched the man who owned my entire soul slowly begin to bend his knees to kneel before the tyrant. And as the fires of war raged mercilessly around us, I watched in absolute, paralyzing horror as my lethal, unyielding alpha slowly began to kneel before his greatest enemy. Chapter 16. Command me. I tore through the screaming chaos of the courtyard, my bare feet completely numb to the jagged stones and burning embers littering the devastated pack square. "Maddox, look at me!" I screamed, a raw, feral command that ripped from the very bottom of my soul and sliced straight through the suffocating haze of smoke and violence. The sheer, undeniable power of our tether snapped his chin up instantly, freezing the tragic motion of his surrender right as his knees were about to hit the blood-soaked earth. The malicious triumph on Gideon's face warped into a furious sneer. But the tyrant completely vanished from my awareness the moment my dark, lethal alpha locked his wide, devastated eyes onto mine. He looked entirely wrecked by my sudden presence, his broad chest heaving with the sudden, violent collision of his profound despair and the undeniable reality that I had shattered steel to reach him. I didn't care about the hundreds of enemy wolves bristling in the shadows, nor did I care about the ancient, archaic laws that dictated how a proper mate was supposed to behave. I threw myself into the center of the hostile circle, crashing violently into his solid chest and gripping the ruined, blood-stained fabric of his shirt with desperate, trembling fists. "You do not yield to him, and you do not dare decide what I am willing to live without," I sobbed fiercely, pressing my tear-streaked face against the frantic, thunderous rhythm of his heart. "I claim you exactly as you are. With your silence, with your scars, and with the beautiful, terrifying darkness you carry to keep this pack safe." The absolute conviction in my voice rang out like a massive silver bell across the ruined courtyard. A public, unequivocal vow of devotion that violently rejected his tragic martyrdom. Maddox released a jagged, agonizing breath that rattled heavily through his massive frame, his large hands immediately coming up to crush me fiercely against his torso. The toxic, suffocating scent of his resignation was instantly incinerated by a roaring, explosive wave of pure petrichor and blindingly hot spice, signaling the violent resurrection of his suppressed predatory instincts. He buried his face in the sensitive curve of my neck, his hot tears searing a permanent brand into my flesh as the impenetrable walls of his self-loathing completely crumbled into dust. My thumbs swept frantically across his sharp cheekbones, memorizing the profound, naked adoration shining fiercely in his dark eyes as the sheer magnitude of my unconditional acceptance finally rooted deep within his soul. The heavy electric air around us began to crackle and hum with the terrifying ancient magic of a fully solidified mating bond, throwing a suffocating blanket of dominance over the entire pack square. Then the most impossible, miraculous thing occurred beneath the frantic pads of my fingers. A physical sensation that completely stopped the rotation of the earth beneath my freezing feet. The thick, jagged scar tissue wrapping brutally across his throat began to vibrate violently. A physical manifestation of the agonizing, impossible war. He was fighting against his own ruined vocal cords. His dark eyes squeezed shut in excruciating concentration, the muscles of his jaw bunching tightly as he stubbornly forced the broken, severed pieces of his past to finally submit to his overwhelming love. "Gala," he rasped, the sound tearing from his lips like rough grinding gravel. A beautiful, agonizingly harsh whisper that shattered the deafening silence of the courtyard and brought the entire war to a grinding halt. Hearing my own name fall from the lips of the man who had not spoken a single syllable in over a decade was a devastatingly pure, holy revelation that completely dissolved the last of my composure. He didn't stop with simply speaking my name, his bloody hands moving up to desperately frame my face as he forced his ruined throat to deliver the ultimate verbal surrender. "Command me," Maddox growled, the gravelly, raw texture of his voice vibrating deep into my bones, carrying a devastatingly heavy weight of absolute devotion and staggering, unchecked power. "I am entirely yours, mind, body, and beast, and I will burn this entire world to ash before I ever let another man claim the territory of your heart." The brutal, beautiful sound of his spoken vow violently triggered the mating frenzy he had been so desperately suppressing, the feral beast completely overriding the civilized restraint of the man. The terrifyingly potent scent of his arousal exploded into the ashy air, a thick, intoxicating cloud that instantly paralyzed my mind and sent a vicious, depuling heat rushing straight to my core. The stunned, terrified silence of Gideon and the invading wolves was entirely irrelevant now, completely overshadowed by the furious, roaring inferno of primal need consuming my mate. Maddox didn't waste a single glance on the coward who had tried to steal his territory. He simply scooped my trembling body into his massive arms with a terrifying, exhilarating possessiveness. He moved with the blinding supernatural speed of an apex predator fully consumed by the hunt, blurring through the heavy smoke and fleeing the ruined courtyard back toward the impenetrable safety of the keep. My face was buried securely against his fiercely beating heart, inhaling the intoxicating, heady musk of his sweat and his overwhelming desire as the chaotic sounds of the outside world completely faded away. We burst back into the dimly lit, suffocating warmth of his original private quarters, the heavy wooden door slamming shut behind us with a resounding, violent finality that sealed our absolute isolation. The absolute explosion of physical intimacy was immediate and completely devastating, leaving absolutely no room for hesitation, gentle words, or the agonizing restraint that had previously tortured us. Maddox practically threw me onto the center of the massive, tangled mattress, his heavy frame following me down a fraction of a second later to completely trap me beneath his scorching heat. His newly found voice was a constant, rough murmur against my skin, a stream of dark, feral praises and desperate prayers that acted like highly volatile fuel on the raging fire in my blood. His calloused hands were ruthless and incredibly demanding, on tearing away the remaining useless shreds of my clothing with a frantic urgency that perfectly mirrored the desperate, clawing hunger tearing through my own veins. The searing heat of his mouth crashed heavily against mine, a bruising, completely uncivilized kiss that tasted of ozone, blood, and a staggering, breathtaking promise of absolute, magnificent ruin. Hearing my name rasp from the ruined throat of my silent alpha shattered the absolute last of his restraint, plunging us headfirst into a furious storm of unstoppable, primal intimacy. Chapter 17. The Roar of the King. The physical impact of his body against mine drove the last coherent thought from my mind, replacing the chaos of the outside world with a universe composed entirely of Maddox. The heavy, intoxicating scent of pine and petrichor completely overwhelmed my senses. I did a thick, musky cloud of arousal that made my blood sing with ancient, primal recognition. His calloused hands were a frantic, possessive force against my bare skin, mapping the curves of my hips and the arch of my spine with a desperate reverence that bordered on worship. Every agonizingly rough sweep of his palms ignited a roaring trail of fire along my nerve endings, completely obliterating the cold terror of the siege and leaving only the blinding heat of our shared destiny. The rough, gravelly sound of my name rumbling from his chest was a continuous, intoxicating prayer against the sensitive skin of my throat, vibrating straight down into the marrow of my bones. He was completely unspooling the tight, ironclad control he had maintained for years, allowing the feral dominance of his wolf to merge flawlessly with the staggering, protective devotion of the man. When he finally shifted his weight to settle perfectly between my trembling thighs, the sheer, breathtaking friction of our bodies aligning drew a ragged, fractured gasp from my lips. I tangled my fingers deeply into the thick, dark strands of his hair, pulling his face up so I could look directly into the bottomless, swirling depths of his entirely unguarded eyes. The profound emotional intimacy waiting in his gaze was utterly devastating, stripping away every remaining layer of defense until our souls stood completely bare before one another. This was not the violent, claiming conqueror the elders had demanded, nor the broken, silent martyr who had walked out to surrender his life in the ash-choked courtyard. This was the true king of the territory, a beautifully fractured, an incredibly powerful man offering me the ultimate unspoken crown of absolute equality within the sacred shelter of our bond. I framed his sharp jawline with trembling hands, silently communicating my profound acceptance of the immense, terrifying power he was willingly placing into my open palms. Maddox released a low, chest-rattling groan that resonated against my collarbone, his large hands sliding up to cup my face with a terrifyingly gentle, deliberate care that completely contradicted the feral hunger in his blood. "My equal," he rasped, the agonizingly raw syllables tearing beautifully from his ruined throat and cementing the absolute, unshakable foundation of our shared existence. My heart, my voice, my queen. The sheer weight of those spoken words shattered the very last remnants of my composure, sending hot, silent tears streaming rapidly down my cheeks to mingle with the sweat and soot on his skin. The time for words and gentle reverence abruptly vanished, entirely consumed by the roaring, undeniable instinct of the mating frenzy that demanded the final physical seal of our intertwined fates. He descended upon my mouth with a searing, bruising intensity, a kiss that tasted of absolute possession, desperate survival, and an eternity of unbroken promises. My back arched completely off the mattress as he finally breached the aching threshold, the sudden magnificent fullness drawing a piercing, breathless cry from the very depths of my soul. The agonizing, exquisite pleasure of our union hit me with the devastating force of a tidal wave, completely drowning out the lingering sounds of the distant conflict and anchoring me entirely to his relentless rhythmic drive. Every powerful, measured thrust drove us higher into the blinding stratosphere of our connection. A beautifully chaotic storm of tangled limbs, gasping breaths, and the intoxicating exchange of our deepest, most primal energies. I met his demanding rhythm with an answering ferocity, my nails scoring half-moon crescents into the heavily muscled expanse of his shoulders as the tension coiled impossibly tight within my lower abdomen. The golden tethering thread of our fated bond materialized vividly in my mind's eye, pulling taut and practically vibrating with the immense, world-altering magic of a true claiming. Maddox's eyes flashed with the brilliant, luminous gold of his inner wolf, signaling the exact, catastrophic moment that the agonizingly beautiful pressure finally fractured into absolute, blinding release. He buried his face deep into the crook of my neck, his powerful jaws opening as his elongated canines deliberately pierced the tender, pulsing skin above my collarbone, in the ultimate sacred bite. The sharp, brief pain was instantly swallowed by a magnificent euphoric rush of golden warmth that flooded forcefully into my bloodstream, physically weaving his soul permanently into the very essence of my being. I cried out his name as the rapturous waves of pleasure completely consumed me, my own teeth sinking instinctively into his heavily scarred shoulder to mirror the eternal, undeniable claim. We rode the devastating, breathless crest of the climax together, suspended in a perfect, timeless void where absolutely nothing existed except the thundering, synchronized rhythm of our two hearts beating entirely as one. The chaotic, explosive energy slowly ebbed into a heavy, intoxicating lethargy, leaving us tangled together in a breathless, sweat-slicked cocoon of profound, unwavering peace. The soft gray light of the approaching dawn had finally begun to creep through the shattered remnants of the bedroom window, painting the horrific destruction of the room in cool, forgiving tones. Maddox remained heavily draped over my exhausted body, his broad chest rising and falling in deep, soothing measures, while his rough thumb traced mindless, comforting circles against the sensitive curve of my hip. He didn't speak again, retreating back into the comfortable, familiar sanctuary of his silence. But the suffocating walls of insecurity that had once accompanied it were entirely, permanently demolished. Hours later, when the brutal reality of the pack's survival demanded our presence, we stood together on the scorched stone balcony overlooking the weary but entirely victorious survivors gathering in the courtyard below. The destructive fires had been completely extinguished, replaced by the fragile, hopeful warmth of the morning sun, cutting brightly through the lingering layers of thick gray ash. I stood confidently at the heavy stone parapet, feeling the solid, immovable warmth of Maddox's massive chest pressing reassuringly against my back, his arms wrapped securely around my waist in a public display of our unbreakable unity. The surviving elders looked up at us with a newfound trembling reverence, and finally recognizing the undeniable, radiant power of a fully completed leadership bond that required no ancient, archaic validations. As the expectant silence stretched across the battered courtyard, waiting for the commands that would begin the arduous process of rebuilding our fractured world, I did not turn to ask my alpha what to say. I knew exactly what he needed, exactly what he felt, and exactly what our people required to heal from the devastating wounds of the night. I raised my chin, projecting my voice loud and clear over the assembly, speaking the definitive, unwavering words of unity and strength that perfectly mirrored the resilient, unbreakable spirit of my mate. Glancing slightly over my shoulder, I caught a lingering, deeply romantic final image of my scarred, lethal king, completely at peace in the morning light, eyes smiling softly as his chosen queen spoke flawlessly for them both. Thank you so much for standing by my side as Maddox and I finally shattered his tragic silence and claimed our eternal destiny in the ashes of the courtyard. I would absolutely love to connect with you, so please leave a comment telling me your favorite moment from our story and what part of the world you are listening from today. If our journey touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to Storm's Werewolf Romance Library to officially join our growing pack. You definitely won't want to miss out on the next upload, because a completely new, breathtaking romance is already waiting just beyond the horizon to sweep you off your feet. Until then, keep your heart completely open and never be afraid to speak up for the ones you love.